everybody. Thank you for coming out to the 2022 Glacier Lake Missoula Cabin Fever series. We've been doing these for a long time. This was actually one of the first lectures that we got back to in 2021, so pleased that you're all here. I'm really happy to be here. And welcome to the Montana Natural History Center. I'm Thurston Elstrom, I'm the Executive Director. Gonna make a few announcements really quick. I want to send out a big thanks. You mentioned Glacier Lake Missoula. Many of you are actually members of the Glacier Lake Missoula chapter of the Ice Age Floods Institute. If you're not, it's something to look into. Great organization, and they do lots of fun events, which you're going to hear more about in just a sec. Also want to thank, huge thanks to Carl Davis, our presenter this evening. Carl has literally written a book on archaeology in Montana, and has worked with some of my old college professors in his extensive career with the National Forest Service. Now, before we get in, and I don't have a lot more to announce, I do want to bring up Jim Sheldon, so you can say a few words, and then we'll proceed with learning about the peopling of the Americas.
Quick commercial. I'm Jim Sheldon. I'm the president of the local chapter of the Ice Age Floods Institute. We have programs and projects all year long. The Trail of the Ice Age Floods has become the first and only National Geologic Trail. Nothing else exists like it in the park system of the country. So, nobody knows what it's supposed to be, and we're building it right now. So if you want to get in on the ground floor, participate in building a unique park in America, I would encourage you to join. Okay? Thank you.
How many rocks are we going to have to move, Jim?
Say again?
How many rocks are we going to have to move?
Lots of rocks.
Okay.
Thanks so much, Jim. All right. Now it's with great excitement that I introduce our speaker for the evening, Carl Davis. Carl was raised in Dillon, Montana. As I mentioned, worked for 35 years as an archaeologist with the USFS, both in Montana and also Oregon. He retired the same year that I came to work at MNHC in 2015. He is the author, as I mentioned, of numerous publications about indigenous archaeology of the plains and Intermountain regions, including 600 Generations, an archaeological history of Montana, which traces our MNHC library, and is definitely something, if you don't have a copy of it, you need a copy of it. It received a High Plains Book Award and the Society for American Archaeology's Best Popular Book Award in 2020. So give a huge round of applause for Carl, and I'll step out of
speaker. I feel like Mick Jagger, but I hope I don't look like Mick Jagger. And I'm demasked, so if anybody's uncomfortable, I'm vaccinated, I'm boosted, and I had a shot of bourbon before I came over, so we should be in good shape. Yeah, I appreciate Jim and Lynn and the Glacier Lake Missoula chapter for inviting me to give this talk. I think it fits really nicely with all the work that you all have been doing over many years dedicated to better understanding of Glacier Lake Missoula and the other prograde, the Glacial Lakes in Montana. And it's sort of culminating in this wonderful trail system. So, you know, my hat's off and much gratitude to all of you folks for working so hard. So what I'm going to do tonight is just talk briefly about the peopling of the Americas, what we know. It's a quick journey in a very complicated story. But I want to say, first off, that in 1491, about 60 million indigenous peoples inhabited the Americas, maybe but a lot of people. They inhabited every corner of North and South America, including the Arctic region. They spoke hundreds of different languages, had all different kinds of life ways, ways of being, ways of thinking. We sometimes group them together as American Indians or Native Americans, but please understand there was as much diversity culturally, linguistically, at North and South America as on any place on Earth. In fact, some people say it's one of the most diverse continents in terms of ethnicity and languages. So we're kind of given to talking about Native Americans, but please understand in this talk tonight that we're talking about wildly different people who evolved over time. We know about the archaeology of indigenous peoples through a lot of hard work that's gone on for a number of years. It's really accelerated in the last 50 years with the passage of federal and state historic preservation legislation. And so universities do work, but agencies like the Forest Service, where I spent my career, we've done a lot of work to try and discover the deep history of Montana. When I was raised in Dillon, history pretty much began with Lewis and Clark, and Native peoples were treated largely as a backdrop to this larger story. And thankfully, that's really changed in the last 20, 30 years. There's lots of educators in every school system that are really dedicated to portraying Native American culture and the story that it has to tell, and how their story is as important to the American story as the story of the colonization of Americans by European peoples. So I'm going to start talking about how people got here, but I always like to start at the beginning. I'm kind of a big history person, so we're going to go way back in time. We're going to go back to Africa. And our human history, the history that we know, has its origins in Africa, and that's a well-known fact. The first peoples that emerged in Africa separated from the great apes about 8 or 9 million years ago. Then evolutionary tree, which is not a tree, it's really a bush with lots of branches and lots of dead ends. But we, our species, or our ancestors of our species, diverged from chimpanzees and bonobos about 6 million years, and then pretty much our lineage was on its way. We've studied paleoanthropologists and archaeologists for lots and lots of years. Olduvai Gorge produced some of the first evidence of early hominids that look more like us than they did their ancestors. And they're the famous Australopithecines, the famous Lucy skeleton. Over time, those species evolved in Africa and are known through a variety of different fossils and different kinds of evidence, which I won't bore you with here. But also now, genetic evidence is coming into play, at least in later stages. So, in Africa, people began to look more like people than their ancestors, and a group of people, collectively called Homo erectus, began to migrate out of Africa 1.8 million years ago, and they moved into Eurasia, into Europe, and settled there. And over time, their cultures created an environment that responded to the glaciation. When it was glaciated, people would move south, and Homo erectus peoples would move north when the glaciers receded. And this process went on for a good million years. But then a new species emerged, or several new species emerged, and it's depicted by that cute little guy looking straight out at you, and that's a Neanderthal. Now, Neanderthals have gotten a lot of bad press, but Neanderthals were extremely sophisticated people. We're about 6 or 8% separated from Neanderthals in our genomes. Now, that's not to say these folks were sophisticated in a way that later hunters and gatherers were, but Neanderthals knew how to get by, and there's a lot of good work that's been done. So the Neanderthals and their cousins, ancestral cousins, living further east in Asia, who are called the Denisovans, and there's actually some other groups that are being discovered through genetics and through archaeology. These people lived in Eurasia, in Europe, and Southeast Asia, and they lived there for a long time. Our species, who we are, Homo sapiens, emerged in Africa about 250 to about 200,000 years ago. And these are anatomically modern people who look just like you and me. More importantly, our genomes are just like yours and mine. And these people look different than the Neanderthals. They look different than the myriad of other groups that were evolving over time and space in Africa and elsewhere. Eventually, these folks apparently got tired of living in Africa because about 70,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, actually, began to leave Africa and began to colonize Eurasia and moved into Europe and so on. And these are the ancestors of all of us. Now, these people were markedly different than the Neanderthals in the sense that they had a pretty sophisticated culture. They made sophisticated stone and bone tools. They importantly sculpted beautiful pieces like this lion figure you see right here. And of course, they painted wonderful cave art in Spain and France and elsewhere. And you can visit some of those places if you're ever in that part of the world. They're really kind of an awe-inspiring experience. And they painted in a perspective and a style that really wasn't, we didn't see until almost the Renaissance in terms of the way they painted using perspective and so on. So we're talking about sophisticated hunting and gathering people. Now these people lived in bands, and bands are composed of interrelated families and friends, elders and children, and they would operate in a band of 30 to 50 people during the hard parts of the year. They would coalesce for communal hunts and social activities and so on. And these people were sophisticated in terms of making decisions about their well-being, where to hunt, where to fish, how to take care of their children. In other words, these people were making the same kind of choices that you and I might if we were stuck out in the wild, although they would be a whole lot smarter about it than most of us here. So these are the people, to set the stage, that traveled out of Africa, then into Europe, then into Eurasia, and then ultimately into North America. And one more backdrop, and this is a little technical, but you guys are the Glacial Lake crew, so this is kind of your bag in a way. I really want to, besides putting sort of the bioevolutionary context, I think it's important to understand a little bit about climate, particularly since climate should be on everybody's mind these days. And it's hard to see this chart, but I want you to look at the bottom half of the chart because our interest today lies in the Pleistocene, which began about 2.5 billion years ago, and that's the Ice Age. And the Ice Age is the genesis of the Ice Age floods like Missoula and so on that we'll talk about later. What we're particularly interested in, if you look up from the bottom of the chart, is the beginning of the Wisconsin glacial period. And that's one of the last glaciations that we've experienced so far. That glaciation got really bad about 25,000 years ago. At least the furthest extent of the glacier is called the Lake Glacial Maximum, about 25,000 years ago. And then global warming began to ensue, natural global warming, and the Earth began to slowly warm, and the ice began to recede. About 14,700 years ago or so, there was a kind of a warming blip called the rolling Aurora For you folks that are thinking about Glacier Lake, Missoula, that was a period where there was significant warming and a significant contribution off the ice sheets to the rivers and streams that fed into the ocean and fed into Glacier Lake, Missoula. And then something kind of bizarre happened. It's called the Younger Dryas. And about 12,700 years ago, there was a cold snap. And it lasted for about 1,000 years. Now, how did this happen? Well, one idea, and I think the most plausible, is that as all of the water poured off the continental glaciers, it slowed down and poured into the North Atlantic. It slowed down or stopped the North Atlantic current, which sweeps along North America, South America. Cold water gets warmed in the South Pacific and the South Atlantic, and then moves up and brings temperate climates to Europe. And all of this flush of cold water slowed down or stopped the current. The Younger Dryas is important because that's the time when Clovis people were here, who we'll talk about. The Younger Dryas ended about 11,700 years ago when the last of the glaciers, the big, massive continental glaciers, had disappeared. And we enter what is called the Holocene, which of course is an interstadial period. It's an interglacial period that we're now in. So the people that we're talking about today, they dealt with variable climate. Now, climate's caused by, climate is weather over time. And climate is caused by a variety of things. The Earth's changes in the Earth's orbital geometry, the way it circles around the sun, the way it tilts, the way it wobbles. When all of those things combine, it creates an environment where there's less sunlight, and it allows that's reaching the Earth for insolation, and that's the cause of an ice age. Now, sunspots, changes in atmospheric circulation, ocean circulation, as we just talked about, are also the cause of climate change, and also volcanoes. About 74,000 years ago, there was an eruption called Mount Toba in Sumatra, Indonesia, and it created undoubtedly a volcanic winter over a period of time. And you might have read about in the paper in the last 5 years, some archaeologists think that there was a population bottleneck and that there might have only been 2,000 surviving human beings anywhere on Earth. More recent studies have found that there is archaeological evidence above and below the ash. So that idea is probably, the dramatic side of that idea is probably doesn't hold water. But surely the volcanic eruptions really created havoc in the Pacific Northwest. For example, Glacier Peak erupted in the Cascades about 13,000 years ago. And so Paleo-Indian people that we'll talk about had to deal with that, particularly if you're living in Washington, Oregon, British Columbia, probably on the plains. Mount Mazama in the Holocene erupted 7,700 years ago to create Crater Lake. And my point is besides environment, hunters and gatherers, just like we all do today, have to deal with all of these natural contingencies of environment, volcanics, and flooding, and all the rest. So let's get to our story. I left off about 35,000 years ago when people had moved out of Africa, had moved into, if you can see, Southwest Asia, heading towards Southwest Asia, moved into Europe about 45,000 years ago, and then moved to the east into Siberia and across the way. Now, things always change in archaeology. You may have read just recently about the new discovery with the Neanderthal occupation overlying a modern Homo sapien occupation, which was then sandwiched by another Neanderthal occupation. And what's wonderful about that site is it pushes the penetration into Europe back another 10,000 years, but it also shows how freely Neanderthal populations and human populations intermixed. In fact, they intermix so much that 2 to 4% of your genome here has part Neanderthal, is part Neanderthal. And that ain't a bad thing, you know. But that just shows that there were different kinds of human groups living in Europe. And this whole idea of this linear progression of this slovenly guy, and pretty soon he's a human being, that's really not the case. There were multiple groups evolving over time and space, but we are the lone surviving species. So these folks moved into Siberia and then began to move into the furthest tip. And where you see the Bering Sea now, between the end of Siberia and Alaska, is called, as you all know, the Bering Strait or the Bering Land Bridge. It's really technically called Beringia. And Beringia was a 600-mile wide piece of land that was inhabited by mammoths, camels, horses, and a variety of species. And so people moved in across the land bridge. The land bridge kind of sort of misleading because it seems like it's people on a march, and it was just merely a bridge to get to America where they really wanted to go. And that isn't how it worked. How it worked is people hunted and fished and gathered their way across. If you were in one band and you had 2 sons in a band and those 2 sons didn't really get along, Grandpa might say, or Dad might say, you know, you need to get your own crew and head over to the hill. And we'll be in touch, we'll work together, but we need to separate and form other bands to survive both the social tension, particularly, but also to survive at large on the landscape. So that's how these people moved across Beringia. Now, Beringia was available because these huge, massive continental ice sheets had sucked up so much water that the ocean levels were about 400 feet lower than they are today, and they exposed the continental shelves. So the Bering Sea was barren land. And it was a lowland, shrubland, it was tundra, but the great, one of my culture heroes, David Hopkins, the great Beringia specialist, talks about being not only a conduit, but a barrier, because just not species, people went across, but there was an exchange of species during the last ice age. Horses moved one way, people moved the other, and so on. So it's kind of a wonderful place. The archaeological record, sadly, is buried under the Bering Sea, although archaeologists are coming up with all kinds of devious ways to try and figure out where those high points might be that they might go while looking underwater. So these people moved across Beringia slowly over thousands of years. Lo and behold, they were in an continent. Of course, they didn't know they were in a continent. It was just more land to be traveled, places to be hunted, places to be searched for berries and fruits and things that kept them alive. The next step is they moved south. And I think most of you know that the prevailing theory was they went through an ice-free corridor between the enormous Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets. The Laurentide is the big one. The Cordilleran is along the Pacific coast. And so people thought, aha, they came across, they wandered down through the ice-free corridor, and voila, they're in a brand new world filled with game and animals and so on. And that was the prevailing idea when I went to school in the early 1970s, mid-1970s. The problem with that, which we'll get to, is that people began finding earlier evidence for people in the New World That was earlier than 13,000 or 14,000 years ago, when it is thought that that ice-free corridor would have been most widely available. And this caused no amount of consternation. The alternative is that people came down along the Pacific coast. And for those of you that follow this sort of thing, this will sound familiar. This idea was around for a long time, that people took boats, but it was ridiculed. But slowly but surely, with these old sites being found, people said there's got to be an alternative route to get south. The problem is as you can see where the Cordilleran just runs dead into the Pacific Ocean, the sheer massive weight of the Cordilleran pushed them down so hard that there was no continental shelf to walk on. There was no barren land as there was in Beringia. So the idea has emerged that these people built boats, and they traveled south along what archaeologists call the Kelp Highway, and they stopped on islands along the way and worked their way down. And people that have traveled the inland passage to Alaska are familiar with the islands and stuff that are available there. And the boats that they were used were made out of wood, scrub wood, and hide. And they are boats that are still used today. They call them umiaks. And they're open boats, they're not kayaks. And indigenous peoples have built these boats. They successfully launched them. There's a wonderful NOAA special about the discoveries of the New World by indigenous people. And there's all these guys and gals, and they're floating in. I don't know how cold the Bering Sea must be, but it must be darn cold. And they're out there floating around in boats. So it could be done. And so people moved down the coast, floated down, stopped on islands, ate seals, fish, and so on, and eventually got to somewhere close to northern Washington, and the Cordilleran began to give way, the ice sheet, and the continental shelf emerged. And about the time they get to the mouth of the Columbia, people went, I'm tired of riding in this old leather boat for my kids. You know, I'm going to get out and I'm just going to walk inland. And so some bands apparently decided that was a good stopping spot, and they hiked up and ascended various routes eastward into North America. The Columbia being a really important one, which has some interesting implications for Glacier, Missoula, in just a second we'll talk about. So what we know is some people then apparently traveled by foot and boat, and they kept traveling southward. We know that people were in South America by at least 14,500 years ago. We actually know that people were there a whole lot longer than that, but that's been kind of conventional wisdom. So they came by foot and boat, and that's how they got to North America and South America. But we're going to go back real quick to the notion of the ice-free corridor, because for a long time in North America, when I was going to school, and I think some of you here going to school, I first did what we learned was the first people, by golly, that came to North America were the Clovis culture. And you probably heard about Clovis. And by golly, they came down the ice-free corridor, looked onto a brand new land, and spread out from there. As I'll talk about, we now know that the Clovis were not the first pioneer peoples that come into North America, but they're really, really important ones. For one, we know a lot about them. They made beautiful projectile points, famous Clovis points that are gorgeous, and you can see some of those Clovis points on display in Helena at the Historical Society. They survived the Younger Dryas. You can see the time period of their existence between 12,800, 900, and 13,500, 200, somewhere in there, years ago. But the most important thing that we Montanans should know is that we have the only Clovis burial site in the Western Hemisphere. And that was discovered in the 1960s near Livingston, actually near Wilsall. And it was the remains of actually 2 children, but one child in particular that was buried with this enormous cache of absolutely gorgeous stone tools and bone tools. Now, the discovery happened accidentally, and the collectors, people collected the artifacts, so we don't really know as much about that site as we really would like to, because it's an incredibly important site. But recently, ancient DNA was taken with the good graces of tribal people from a Clovis child, and that Clovis child demonstrated a genetic connection to Asiatic peoples. So it's a really important site because it demonstrates proof positive that that little Clovis child was related to a little boy who was discovered in a site called Malta in Siberia 24,000 years ago. So there's this genetic linkage, and it's immensely important, and there's another site we'll talk about. So Clovis has been a really cool thing for archaeologists to study, and it's been so cool that people have a hard time giving up the idea that Clovis was here first. So the first volley that was fired about people were here earlier than Clovis came from a site in Pennsylvania where I worked on back in the Pleistocene, it seems like, where I went to graduate school. It was excavated by the University of Pittsburgh. It's called the Meadowcroft Rock Shelter. It's a National Historic Site. And here they found in the deep strata cultural remains dating between maximum 15 to 17,000 years ago. And one of the key pieces is that little lanceolate point that was found embedded in the deepest sediments. Probably one of the great moments of my life was standing there and looking down and seeing that. I made a smart aleck comment, which I want to do, and was told to promptly leave with my crew. But what really happens with these kinds of things is immediately excavation ceased, and the excavator, Jim Adavasio, immediately said, "We've got to call in folks to take a look at this." So all of the Paleo-Indian experts that he could find came and looked at this site. Meadowcroft has gotten a lot of bad press for 2 reasons. There's a lot of critics. The first is that the coal, which is, of course, indigenous to Pennsylvania, so to speak, the argument was that it had contaminated the early dates. And Adavasio's argument back was, well, if it contaminated the early dates, why didn't it contaminate the rest of the dates? All the dates are in perfect order from top to bottom. So that was kicked out. The more troubling piece is that the environmental data that was collected from Meadowcroft suggested that it existed in a conifer pine deciduous forest setting, which didn't fit this model of frozen tundra. Adavasio again came back and said, this wasn't this uniform tundra. There wasn't woolly mountains running all over the place. The further south you got from the ice sheets, the better it got. And so I think he, to me, has convincingly demonstrated that that's probably a good possibility. My old mentor, that's not the word I wish I had been mentored by him, but David Hopkins would definitely say, yeah, folks, even in Beringia, it was a very, very diverse landscape. So anyway, Meadowcroft is the first in the line of sites that have produced really old dates that precede Clovis. But again, like I say, some people don't really accept those dates yet. And in fact, there are older dates that have been derived from the shelter, but I think Adavasio got a little gun shy, just trying to get past the Clovis bar at 15,000. But there's an old date, the 21,000 date, that looks looks like there's a plated basket that's associated with that date. But the bracketed dates are they're such a big span that they're uncomfortable arguing for earlier occupation as fiercely as they did the occupation in stratum 2A. So, Monte Verdi saves the day in Chile, and it was excavated by a guy named Tom Dillahay, who was then with the University of Chile. And this is the site that finally convinced folks that people were here before clothes. And it is an awesomely cool site. You couldn't ask for a better site to demonstrate the earlier occupation, because the site is sealed off under peat. And so there's remarkable preservation of perishable artifacts, stakes wrapped with hide, fiber, and all kinds of really cool tools. In architectural remains, it looks like some kind of a small shed, or what they call a shaman's hut, which archaeologists always do. Well, if you can't figure out what it is, the shaman must have been here. But so we don't really know what it was used for. There was a child's footprint found, which will play out here a little later. And again, Tom Dillahay has older dates. But Dillahay, and I don't know if this is anecdotal or if it's real, but Dillahay, there was so much criticism, intense criticism from the Clovis first crowd, that even with all this evidence and this remarkable site, Dillahay said, if I had to do it again all over, I wouldn't do it. So that's the level of debate and animosity that occurred between the pre-Clovis and the Clovis first crowd. Just moving around, I only have a few more sites just to demonstrate the point, but this site is now in Texas, and it's called Butterburn Creek. It's actually composed of two sites called Galt and Friedkin, or Gabriel Friedkin. And the cool thing about this site is that it has a pre-Clovis level underneath the Clovis level. So now you can really say, okay, here's Clovis, here's pre-Clovis. You could see that they recovered lancet, they bifaces like that little guy up there, all kinds of tools and blades. They found a stone pavement, so maybe somebody laid down a pavement and put apples or or some kind of a shelter. They found engraved limestones. They found lots of cool stuff. Again, this is well south of the ice sheet. Now, there wasn't organics, very many organics, because the acidic forest soils on the Everest Plateau. But they did a dating called optical stimulated luminescence, which for us amateurs like me, basically it measures the last time quartz sediments were exposed to sunlight. And I've done this or participated. You put a core in the sediment sample, and it's sealed off and can't be exposed to daylight. And in the lab, it's exposed, stimulated optically, and the feedback is measured, and then a formula is calculated to give some estimate of the time frame. And it's proven to be a really wonderful method where you can't use radiocarbon. So anyway, a site in Texas, another pre-Clovis site. What's the really important thing here is that the pre-Clovis site, it was kind of, there wasn't a ton there. It looked like people were camping and moving on. But boy, the Clovis level was just filled with stuff. So what that tells you immediately is the pre-Clovis people were the pioneers, the first people who got there. And the Clovis people came in and settled. They were the settlers, if you want to use that analogy. This is a great site, Paisley 5 Mile Point Caves in Oregon, in southeastern Oregon, a mountain in the dry desert. Oregon is famous for caves. Archaeologists love the caves, but sort of artifact collectors who have dug the whole hell out of a lot of them. But where they haven't, archaeologists have been able to move in and do some excavation. And a site that was known in the 1930s was excavated by a guy called Luther Gressman. people returned in 2000s and the 2000s, and they've again come up with some early dates. The K5 in particular draw your attention to is 14,100 to 14,500 years ago, a full 1,000 years before Clovis. You guys might have read about this in the news too. This is famous because in this cave they found prehistoric poop. And the prehistoric poop could be dated, and one of the 14,200-year-old dates came from it. But they could also analyze it for DNA. And in this case, it was mitochondrial DNA that's inherited solely through the female line. And again, it demonstrated this ancient genetic connection with Asiatic people. So this is a hugely important site. They also, real quickly, they found hand stones and artifacts, and we can do blood residue. We can study the ancient residue off flakes and tools. And in this case, it was elephant or mammoth, and also on one tool, it was horse. So we know these people were living in association with Ice Age fauna. And these people were living next to a big fluvial lake. Remember I talked about that bowling Halaroid 14,700 years ago, that moist lip that probably produced a lot of the volume that came into Glacier Lake, Missoula. Well, it produced these enormous, what we call fluvial lakes. And this baby was 450 square miles. So that's a lot of water, a lot of country to hang out in, and great habitat for animals. And that's why people live here. Close to home. This site has also been in the news. Cooper's Ferry. It's on the lower Salmon River, on a river terrace. A guy named Warren Davis, no relation. Oregon State has been working on it for a number of years in cooperation with the BLM. And he initially found dates as an occupational layer that was kind of Clovis in age, although there's a point tradition out there called Western Stem Points that are sort of coeval, they thought, with Clovis. But he dug some more, and lo and behold, he had a lower occupation level that dated again to 14,000 to 16,000 years ago. There were pits and fire bars. Unfortunately, his river terrace is kind of like that Butterburn Creek. They don't preserve bone, and so he didn't get a lot of good fauna. They did find a fossilized tooth fragment of a Pleistocene horse. So, you know, that's down in the river valley. Here's the deal: the lower Salmon River, 200 miles from Missoula, Montana, Glacier Lake, Missoula. So, the punchline: people were probably very well aware that Glacier Lake, Missoula existed. Finally, the last site, and the one that's gotten international attention, is White Sands National Park. And lo and behold, these folks, an international team, discovered footprints of Paleo-Indian people. And these footprints dated between 21 and 23,000 years ago. Again, to me, this is pretty much the nail in the coffin that people were here. Now, they dated these footprints by seeds that were located above and below the footprints, and in some cases squished in between the toes. They dated hundreds of samples. Just like Meadowcroft, just like Berti, there are always critics, as there should be, because we're doing science. And so people questioned whether those dates had been contaminated. There's a thing called a reservoir effect, where carbonates from new rocks or soils leach and contaminate. And they did the same thing as Advasio did at Meadowcroft. They ran hundreds of dates. They sent them to different labs. They sent in all kinds of technical analysis. And lo and behold, it just kept coming back. I was like, okay guys, give up. It's 21 to 23. So this is a remarkable find. These people, there's no handmade, there's no tools, because these people were walking across what would have been a Tule marshland then. There's a wonderful photo of illustration of a gal carrying her child across, and they're carefully studying the dynamics of footprints, and they can tell she had a child on her hip. She's looking back like this. She sets the child down, picks the child up, and off she goes. Nearby were footprints of woolly mammoths, dire wolf. So it's really is critically important site. The biggest thing is it begs the question of these guys are not close to that last glacial maximum to get clear down into this region. Did they come down the ice free, or did they come down the Pacific coast even far earlier, come down 30,000 years? But if I were you, I would go out and Google this site. There's a lot of this information in proprietary, so I don't have good photos of the feet, but you can go on the National Park Service site and look at them and read the story. National Geographic always does a great job, but this is really an amazing find. Now, it's not about these, but I just want to point out that there are older sites that have been equally well excavated, many of them, but they just don't have irrefutable evidence of pre-Clovis or the evidence that supports the dates in association with people. I think what's going to happen is some of these dates and sites are going to be seriously reconsidered in light of the White Sands National Park find. I draw your attention to the last site, though, called the Cheruti Mammoth site. That's got a date of 130,000 years. The evidence is broken mastodon bone that seems to be broken by humans. But as always in archaeology, it's hard to tell sometimes whether the rocks have been made by human or by nature, and certain bones being fractured by humans of nature. So I think that we will see a harder look at these. The truth of the matter is, North American archaeologists have been a little arrogant about their approach to archaeology, and I don't think that they've given the South American archaeologists the credence that they deserve. And I think that our South American archaeologists are going to go, okay guys, we have been saying this all along and nobody's listening. So I think the South American crowd are pretty pleased with some of the work that's been done recently. And let's finally get to the glacial Lake Missoula, and by now you guys should know the answer whether people were here or the glacial Lake Missoula was here. Here's a few factoids. We all know that glacial Lake Missoula was around 50,000 to 13,000, maybe a little earlier. There's still work that's being done. It had repeated cataclysmic discharge and then infilling. So far, what I've read and what I've heard is it's probably poor aquatic habitat. There weren't fish available. There's certainly no evidence of Pleistocene fauna, but that's kind of a sampling problem. I am certain the waterfowl would probably have used glacial Lake Missoula and the other pro-glacial lakes around northern Montana, particularly in the real slack water areas, way back up at the end of the Butterburn, for example. You could see a whole flock of snow geese or trumpeters or whatever sailing in. But by and large, it's a pretty uninhabitable place, I think, for humankind. Now, when I started school back in the 70s, it was, again, Clovis first. We might have made a joke about, Little Bear saying to his buddy, what's that loud noise on the river? But nobody seriously thought about the association with humans in glacial Lake Missoula. And so I think there's been a long history of no interest and no research in terms of where human occupation might be. And And every time I go up to Mount Sentinel or any high point, I'm always looking. But, tools could have been left by any tribe throughout the Holocene as well as the Pleistocene. But, the answer to the question is, indeed, Native people were probably here to at least see it, and who some of those people might be were the people that are living just across the mountain at Cooper's Ferry. So I think the answer to the where did people pre-Clovis is we need to look elsewhere, and I'm showing my provincial values or childhood myopia, but southwestern Montana would be a good place to look, for example. And this is a picture of the Merrill site down near Lima. It's an incredible paleontological site. Obviously, these beasts wouldn't be happy hanging out together like this, but the artist did this to show all the different kinds of species that were found at Merrill. And way back in the background, you can't really see it. She's also depicted two Paleo-Indians and their dog, although there's no evidence of Paleo-Indians at Merrill yet. But I've worked in the Centennial Valley, I've worked around southwestern Montana, I'm dead certain there's pre-Clovis, or certainly Clovis. It just has yet to be found. But as this little guy looking out over southwestern Montana, that's a big landscape. There's a lot of places to look. A lot of it's private land. So discovery is always an issue. One thing that archaeologists are doing is they're hiring geomorphologists or geoarchaeologists. And basically, they're looking for old landforms and old dirt that might contain Paleo-Indian level of occupation. And that means anything from pre-Clovis, going back, let's say now, 20,000 years, all the way to the early Holocene. And so far, those searches are, I don't know what they've come up with, BLM, Forest Service, they all do this kind of secret stuff, but I think eventually, a site will come to light. Finally, I'd just like to end about Indigenous memory. It's been said that archaeology is an imperial or colonial project that really doesn't serve the interests of Indigenous peoples. They're not heard, their voice is not understood. And that actually has occurred for a long time in archaeology, particularly with Paleo-Indian studies, but all the way through. In the course of my career, that relationship with tribes and interest in archaeology has really changed, but it is definitely a work in progress. So, again, back in the 70s, in the 80s, the idea was with Glacier like Missoula, and let's Clovis first. Well, people were here, it'd be a hard place to live, but they probably weren't here. And also that Indigenous peoples didn't have a thing to say about Glacier like Missoula. But in fact, there is evidence in oral histories and stories that these people were definitely aware that a large lake once existed. They were aware that this large lake was a nasty place to be in and discharge. Kyle has a lot of fun stories to talk about that. Now we go, boy, that's 15,000 years ago. That's a long time for cultural memory to persist. But, people have lived here in place. We're a room full of immigrants. I don't mean that in a bad way, but where our ancestral homeland is not Montana. But the Kootenai, they've been here for 600, 900 generations. So it's conceivable that some glimmer of a cultural memory about Glacier Lake, Missoula was passed along by bits and pieces to this very day. And again, this is a piece of research that I think badly needs to be done to pull a lot of this evidence together, because I think that would really dramatically increase the thrill of walking the Glacier Lake, the trail. And finally, we're in the Holocene. That's a whole different chapter. I put a bunch of illustrations from my book just to try and show how complicated that lifeway was from 11,700 years ago to the present. But the big message here is all of this would not happen without those hardy pioneers braving the wilds of Thuringia, braving the wilds of the North Pacific Ocean, braving saber-toothed cats and short-faced bears, and somehow emerging to occupy this continent that we call North America and South America. So it's a pretty neat history. It's a history I think needs to be taught in every school class in Montana. And our history really begins 15,000 years ago, and not with Lewis and Clark. So I just put a few popular archaeology references up. Their library shelves full of this kind of stuff. But here's a few. You can always, Brian Fagan is always one of the best popular archaeology writers there is. I can send this to anybody that wants it there. I could send you a laundry list, but the nice thing about these is they have great bibliography. So with that, I can open it up to questions. I just want to thank everybody for having me here, and particularly Jennifer and Jim and Lynn and Thurston for making this all happen. So thanks very much.
So I think the Bering Strait, didn't it come down right beside the Rocky Mountain front and Browning? Was it?
You know, Beringia is just that stretch of land between Siberia and Alaska. That's Beringia. And then, you know, certainly Beringia extends down into coastal British Columbia, but very quickly that Cordilleran ice sheet just comes slam diving into the ocean. And so there's no continental shelf, there's no land mass to walk down.
Then I'm saying around the Bering Strait, that interglacial corridor.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, it does. It comes right down the Rocky Mountain front, a little bit further out than that. It kind of weaves and wobbles. Nobody's really quite sure the exact route. One of the issues with the ice-free corridor is, you know, when it was available, when it was open, when it was closed, but also how interesting it would have been to the mammals that would travel down through the corridor on which these people depended. So it's not just a human problem, it's kind of a biological question of how viable the corridor actually would have been. Sorry, I misinterpreted you.
Are there some people that archaeologists have that any ancient man came from Europe on the east side?
Yeah, so there was, I think, two great archaeologists. They proposed that people came with the same kind of principles in mind from Europe, crossed through Greenland and that piece of the world, and popped in to populate northeastern U.S. based again on the same principles that the continental shelf would have been available, and so on. And they really locked onto the fact that the points, they're called Solutrean in Europe, looked a lot like Clovis technology. And so they were really linking the technologies together. But, you know, that really hasn't held water. There's several books written on it. But I think the notion is, and I think genetic evidence really points most strongly to the Asiatic route.
Could you repeat the questions when people ask? People online can't hear.
Sure.
Thank you.
That might have been the last question. Yeah.
Have you read
DNA origins?
I haven't yet. I've seen it. I've read a little bit about it. I think what she does is talk about a lot of the same things that I talked about tonight. She might dress them up a little bit, that this is kind of new and nobody's thought about this before. I detect a little bit of that in at least the newspaper coverage. That's newspapers or newsprint. But it would be a great book, I'm sure to read. But I think a lot of these ideas about people being here really early, genetic evidence connecting Asiatic peoples and so on has been around at least for the last probably 5 years. Yeah.
Carl, you touched on earlier, kind of at the beginning of your presentation, lots of different groups of people that were flowing into the New World and also occupying Beringia. And one of the things that I've barely scratched the surface on, I was wondering if you could expand on this at all, but ethno-linguistics and archaeologists have been tracing back language groups from different cultures in the Western Hemisphere into parts of Asia. And it seems one of the things that was interesting and going on was that there was the languages were going back and forth into Eurasia, or Asia rather, and North America and South America. Is that, I feel like that's something that is also helps that genetic evidence, but is that something that you've come across, and can you expand on that at all?
Yeah, so the question is, does linguistic evidence help solve the problem of New World colonization? Yeah, there's been a couple of different theories about different language groups being key, not so much going towards Siberia, but coming into the United States or North America. And it achieved a lot of popularity. Linguistics is a terribly hard subject to understand, but there were sort of 3 different waves, with the Athabascan wave being the last that came in 4,000 years ago, because people were coming and going. But I think that idea has had a lot of holes poked in it. The simple truth is that there's really no archaeological signature that definitely links the old world with the new. In the Salmon River, Lauren Davis thinks he has, with his western stem points, things that look like were found in Japan and that part of Asia. But of course, people are firing at him all the time about that. So there's really not a clear archaeological signature. There's not a fossil signature at all, because burials are extremely rare of that age. There's not a linguistic linkage that's very clear and apparent. And there's, at one point, people were trying to use blood types, what blood types were more common in the old world versus the new. And all of those have been shot down, or they haven't really achieved the level of proof necessary. The most solid thing, and the thing that's changing all of our lives, is genetics. And the genetic signature is proof in the pudding. But archaeologists talk about, this tool looks like one that was made in Japan, so therefore they were connected to the ancient Roman culture. Those are really good arguments, but they're not necessarily, or hypotheses, but they're not necessarily proven. So there's been a whole variety of different things, but genetics. But the problem with genetics is you need human burials to derive a genetic sample, and Native Americans are rightly very sensitive about genetic studies, again, appropriating their history through genetics. So, we're lucky to have Paisley. We're lucky to have hens. And there's some geneticists that are really working well with the tribe. So I think eventually we will have more genetic linkage. It'll be kind of yesterday's news, but we're not there yet.
What year were the white sands footprints discovered?
Well, they were initially discovered in 2008, and but the human footprints, I think just a couple of years ago. The great thing about these folks is they kept on the QT because they didn't want that evidence to get ruined, and they wanted to really have this baby nailed, and so they spent lots of seasons out there, and then it began to leak out that there's this incredible find, but it's really hit the newspapers within the last 2 years, and they're continuing to do work. They're finding lots more kids' footprints than they are adults. And the way she's wonderful. She's on a bunch of podcasts. I don't remember her name right off the bat. But anyway, she talks about this because she's doing all of the animal and footprint work. And she said, imagine if a playground, and you're going to go pick up your kid, and the two moms are standing over there, and the kids are running circles around you. And she said, I think that's what we're seeing. They're out collecting, gathering, and they're visiting. These kids are just running every place.
That find in California is 130,000 years old.
Yeah.
I've lost track. When did the Homo sapiens, could it be three Homo sapiens?
Now, this would be, if you would have two choices, you would have Neanderthals or Denisovans, more likely Denisovans because they lived in that part of the world. Or you could have, anatomically modern people, Homo sapiens. So at this point, one of those groups could have theoretically figured out prior to Wisconsin how to get down into North America and kill a mammoth in Southern California. So, and it isn't as though this guy and gal were doing the excavation or just kind of out there digging away. I mean, they did meticulous excavations. It's just that the evidence right now is just a little bit short. If they can find a big hammerstone, if they can find one little plate that was definitely made, then this would just blow North American archaeology, just find out where they'll have to really think everything over again. Yeah.
Where is that site in California?
I wish I could tell you, but I can't remember.
Oh, it's okay.
Old age, golden fog. Yeah, what was it?
Are the footprints, white sands, solid? Are they in concrete?
I'm sorry, they're in gypsum, so they're basically fossilized in an old playa that are fossilized. And, there are different levels of footprints, as I understand it. And so it's a remarkable site, but they're really well preserved. You really can't say, this might be somebody monkeying around, or this might be a mastodon that was trying to fool people by pretending like it was him. Well, thank you guys very much for your patience.
I want to echo the thank you. What a wonderful presentation. Fabulous discussion. I always knew that ethno-linguistics was. Anyway, thank you all again for coming out. I'm going to welcome Jim up just to close out the evening. Hope to see you all back here real soon.
Well, brief talk, a lot of new things to think about. Just add one thing, the dating technique of stimulating quartz grain to see the last time they've seen sunshine. That's being used to date the floods, and that's brand new for us. A lot of you may not have heard of that, but it's the first time we've been able to do that, and the picture is at least 3 very large floods, about 18,000. and then a mild hiatus, and then picking up lesser floods, extending out maybe to 10,000 years, or maybe even a little bit younger on some very small floods. So we have some dates, and that's what it looks like. Okay? Thank you for coming.